Finally then, I want to use Bao Nin's novel to explore the relationship between war and narrative. And hopefully I can bring in these two previous points about ghosts and the Gothic and disintegration. The critic Kate McLaughlin, who has written extensively on war writing, says this. She says, "Not finding words for war may be the most potent technique for conveying its magnitude." What McLaughlin finds in war writing, then, is an advertisement of its own inadequacy. The fear that in explaining war may in some way justify it. And so that writers of war texts often allude to the difficulty of writing about war as a way of showing its horror. And to some degree, Bao Nin's text does this also. In the post-war years of the novel, we see the main protagonist, Kien, struggling with his manuscript. Crossing out, erasing, crossing out again, editing, tearing up some pages, then tearing up and destroying all. Then he starts all over again, making out each new syllable like a learner trying to spell a new word. To some degree, then, Bao Nin's novel is as much about writing about war as it is about war itself. And I've highlighted the end of this quote, trying to spell a new word, because this suggests to me how war requires a kind of writing which goes beyond the simple realist image. And this idea of trying to spell a new word shows us why some writers have a recourse to the Gothic mode or ghosts when trying to depict and render war. Ghosts in the sorrow of war are representations of a traumatized consciousness. Two ideas from the critic Cathy Carruth are extremely illuminating when thinking about Bao Nin's text. Firstly, she says that trauma is repeated suffering of the event, but it is also continued leaving of its site. And secondly, she says that survival itself then, in other words, can be a crisis. Bao Nin's novel plays out this repeated suffering of the event and the continued leaving of its site. It constantly returns to memories of war and then back to the present and the crisis of survival. Kien is the only survivor of a battalion of hundreds of men, and there is a certain guilt that comes with his survival. He writes partly through compulsion, and partly also because he is consistently visited by ghosts of his dead colleagues. So in a sense then, what we have with The Sorrow of War is both a Gothicized and traumatized narrative, and the two ideas overlap. The text covers multiple time frames between 1965 and 1985. There is, however, no discernible chronology. It's as if the text has been traumatized by war, Gothicized so that it is continually haunted by repeated trauma. There's a similarity here with another very famous war novel. I'm thinking of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, in which the main protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, has come unstuck in time. So one of the reasons I'm so interested in war and narrative is that war seems to demand of writing a very undoing of chronology and time itself. And modes such as the Gothic allow for this playing with the rules of time and the creation of texts which in some ways mimic a traumatized consciousness. I want to round up this presentation by thinking about all of these things spatially. and then adding some final thoughts about the importance of war writing. So far I've been looking at Bao Nin's use of ghosts and the Gothic, and this idea of disintegration as a way of producing a war narrative, a kind of traumatized consciousness within a narrative. And I think there is a very strong argument for texts which operate in this kind of way, which rather than make sense of war, look to bring its nonsense or non-rationality to the reader. And Bao Ninh does this with his use of ghosts and the Gothic and disintegration. However, there is a degree to which the text moves in the opposite direction. And this informs my final idea about the importance of war writing. At the very beginning of the novel, Kien, the main protagonist, is working for the Missing in Action Remains Collecting team. And their horrible task in the early post-war years is to look for the bodies of the war dead. And while this episode is most certainly one of the most traumatic moments in the novel, it can also be seen as a kind of synergetic project. The gathering of the dead can be seen as parallel to the gathering of memory. And the act of writing itself synergizes, if you will, a whole new readership to come and bear witness to the horrors of war. So in Bao Nin's novel, along with all the most important war writing, there is a communal and individual project at work simultaneously. On the one hand, if we think of T.S. Eliot, these fragments Bao Ninh has shored against his ruins. And it is also a kind of rebellion, if you like, against the overarching communist ideology of war and reunification. But there is also a communal project at work here, in that the writer is a kind of node of communal suffering. And the writing, in this case the novel, will be passed on to a global community. To close, I'd like to leave some hanging questions. Does the horror of war or conflict consistently require modes of writing beyond straight realist depictions? Is all war fiction inherently Gothic? And can we usefully apply Western conceits and theories to Asian writing, and vice versa? I hope you have found this presentation informative and useful in some way, and I thank you for taking the time to watch and listen. If you have any questions or comments, you can contact me at laoshijohn@gmail.com. Thank you.